I really want to get it stuck into tonight, this big report out today about social cohesion, or lack of, actually. So many people actually dare even really say what they think anymore because they're terrified about the ramifications of that. I want to look at these so-called community leaders, self-appointed, by the way, that seem to be causing quite a few problems in certain scenarios. I want to explore all of it. There was very damning findings as well when it comes to the Batley school teacher. We'll get into all of that, worry not. But before we do, let's talk China, shall we? Because the Prime Minister has described China as the biggest threat to the UK's economic security. Now I can cross live to our GB News Home and Security Editor, Mark White. Good evening to you, Mark. Bring my viewers up to speed with what on earth has been going on now.
Well, these are cyber attacks that have taken place over the last few years. In fact, the government has now pointed the finger firmly at the Chinese state. In particular, an attack that happened in 2021, which attacked the Electoral Commission, and some 40 million people's details were compromised during that attack. Also, at that time, 43 individuals, including MPs and peers, were the victims of cyber attacks as well. So the government coming out today and pointing the finger, as I say, firmly at Beijing. But I have to say, listening to the Deputy Prime Minister as he made his statement to the Commons and then listening to the reaction of MPs in the chamber, it was a sense of, well, is that it? You know, it had been heavily trailed in the newspapers that this was the British government about to get really tough with the Chinese government for what has been going on. But really, all that was mentioned in the way of any kind of sanctions here were a couple of officials who are on the sanctions list and a very small company with about 50 employees also being sanctioned. And in addition to that, the Chinese ambassador will be summoned before the Foreign Secretary some 3 years after the events. One of the MPs in the chamber said it was as if the government had gone to a gunfight with a wooden spoon. Ian Duncan Smith, the former head of the leader of the Conservative Party, himself an outspoken critic of the Chinese Communist Party and who has been the subject of a number of cyber attacks, he said the government's approach was like an elephant giving birth to a mouse. He said that he wouldn't be intimidated by what Beijing was doing. He would continue to be an outspoken critic of the Chinese government. But he's been the subject of multiple cyber attacks over the years, including on one occasion someone who was impersonating him, emailing lots of contacts of his, saying that he'd recanted his views on the Chinese state. So that's kind of dirty tricks that they're up to. It is a big and a growing problem, not just China, but Russia, North Korea, Iran, a number of other countries that want to sow division in Western democracies.
Indeed, fascinating stuff. That's our Home and Security Editor, Mark White. Thank you very much. I mean, I've got to say, I was trying not to laugh, actually, at some of the descriptions that have been used, but I dare say that Beijing are probably not quaking in their boots right now.
No, I don't think they're quaking at all. And it is a homemade problem, isn't it? Over the last 20 years, we've had successive governments actually trading with China, getting progressively friendlier with China. Only 4 years ago, 5 years ago, Theresa May was thinking of having our next nuclear facility built by China. 4 years ago, Boris Johnson was going to put Huawei through our 5G network. And even
David Cameron, of course, he's coming under fire today as well.
Absolutely. And Osborne. I mean, they were the ones who wanted to take China under their wing. And we've created an unholy relationship with China where we trade. Our trade is so dependent on cheap Chinese product, including, by the way, electric vehicles, which are now flooding Western Europe and the UK, which presumably could be switched off by the flick of a switch in Beijing. So we've got really unjoined up or non-joined up thinking on China. And the last foreign policy point I'd just like to make is that we've all sat back in the West and allowed China to roll out its Belt and Roads program right across Africa, South Asia, establishing a political and economic presence in countries which we have eschewed relationships with because they're not democratic or for whatever our high-minded idealistic principles are, when actually we should have been taking steps to see China out of those resource-rich countries. We've sat here, invited China into the position it's in, and we've been asleep on it. And the last thing I just quickly say is Donald Trump warned us about China when he was president, and everyone rolled their eyes at him. The liberal, educated elite all thought this was Trump, doing another Trumpian kind of... you remember the skit where you just see Donald Trump repeatedly saying China, China, China? It's because he was warning us about China, as he did about Russia. We've been asleep at the wheel, and now we've got to take a... By the way, I don't think a knee-jerk reaction to China now is going to be the answer. We've got to take a measured response which extricates ourselves from this problem carefully.
I just want to bring in a couple of viewers before I bring you in, Jadita. Gary says, Michelle, it's all very simple. We simply cannot do without China anymore. He makes that point that we've just been hearing there as well, which is pretty much everything that we use now seems to have been either made entirely in China or certainly components of. David says the thing that would scare China the most is if we started to make our own things once more. He says, though, perhaps we've let our manufacturing sectors, though, go to rack and ruin, haven't we? David says, Michelle, you've all gone bonkers, not only at GB News, but the country at large. He says, who on earth wants to actually take on China? Boris, etc., thinks we should be taking on China as well. He says, meanwhile, you can't even protect a Batley school teacher. What are you guys on? He asks. But you don't quite ask it like that, but it's tea time, but that's how I've summarised it. Jadita, what do you think?
I do agree that it's a self-created problem, but the situation you're finding yourselves in the UK now is China has become the second largest economy in the world. That's not by accident. They're particularly adept at high productivity at low cost, which they outsource to the world. And that's what the world has taken advantage of. So the writing was on the wall from the beginning. What you have now here is China trying to test that, this has been decades in the building. And now they're trying to test the resilience of what they've built. When you've webbed yourself out, the dependency on your country throughout the world, how much power and influence do I have, particularly on an influential power like the UK? Now they've done something as fundamentally wrong as breaching the electorate. You've got to do something. You've got to be seen to do something, and that something has to have effect. It cannot look like a slap on the wrist.
But what then? Do what?
That's what you have to think about, because what they're going to be thinking is, how do I mitigate risk? Because Xi Jinping, like Putin, is a reactionary leader. If you take out sanctions, they will return fire. Can the UK withstand that? What the UK should have been doing is outsourcing dependency. The things you need China for, you should be finding under other countries to do it for you.
But that ship has sailed now.
But with problems like this, it's too late. When you talk about too late, that is true, but you've got to build going forward. You've got to make very quick changes, very substantive changes now, so that 5 years down the line, you can contend with not having China being so dependent on China. Otherwise, all they're going to prove to you is that the UK needs us, and so we can do anything with the UK without any reaction.
It always blows my mind, that China seems to just got off the hook for COVID. They brought the world's economies pretty much to its knees and then some.
The Wuhan virus.
What consequences were there for that? Nothing.
Yeah, well, the WHO is, one of its largest funders is China. And we're about, by the way, to hand over pandemic management in this country to the WHO. It's daft as brushes.